जल्दी है चले जाइए 11 से 2 तक मान के चल तो ही आ जाइए वो तो गई
That's commitment.
That's commitment.
Hello and welcome everybody to Center for Justice Law and
Sorry, really sorry to interrupt. We decided to wait for
एक फोन हो गया
No, the live is on.
मैंने कर दिया
Okay, ठीक है.
भाई लो साइलेंट कर ले तो देखेगा तभी तो व्हाट्सएप पे मेल पे भेजा है
But I understand.
चेक करता हूँ नोट्स में दिखाऊंगा
Hello and welcome everybody to the Center for Justice, Law and Society's Law and Justice Scholar Lecture of 2024. This lecture is part of our Law and Justice Visiting Scholar program that was introduced in 2022 by CJLS. The Center for Justice, Law and Society, CJLS, is a queer intersectional feminist research center in Jindal Global Law School that critically engages with contemporary issues at the intersection of law, justice, society, and marginalization in South Asia. It is a collaborative endeavor of scholars, activists, and students engaged in high-quality empirical and theoretical research. CJLS foregrounds the question of justice, especially intersectional justice, in law and society studies to respond to the changing interrelationship between law and society, and inaugurates a distinct terrain of research that is not mimetic of Western mainstream paradigms of law and society studies, or studies that do not focus on justice as a central theme. Today's lecture will be delivered by Nikita Sonavane, the CJLS Law and Justice Scholar of 2023-24. Nikita is a legal researcher and an advocate, and the co-founder of the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project, a Bhopal-based litigation and research intervention focused on building accountability against criminalization of oppressed caste communities by the police and the criminal justice system. Additionally, Nikita has previously worked on issues of local governance, forest rights, and gender in Gujarat. The lecture will be discussed by Professor Dhiren Barissa. Dr. Barissa is a Dalit queer activist, poet, and an urban sexual geographer, and is currently an assistant professor at Jindal Global Law School. His research engages with sexual mappings and makings of cities from an intersectional and decolonial lens, both among queer spaces in India and in diasporic queer worldlings. In order to begin today's program, I would like to invite Professor Deepika Jain, Professor and Vice Dean and Director for CJLS, Jindal Global Law School, to share her introductory remarks.
Thank you, Firoza. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. One of the core pillars of CJLS's vision, as outlined by Firoza, lies in fostering vibrant interaction and serving as a bridge between activism, academia, and political engagement, centering the question of economies of knowledge production. With this guiding principle, we introduced the Law and Justice Visiting Scholar program in 2022. This program embodied our commitment to host scholars, activists, lawyers, artists who contribute to the vibrant exchange of ideas that define our academic community. The Law and Justice Visiting Scholar program teaches a 2-credit self-designed elective for our students enrolled in the law school program at JGU on a subject addressing a key contemporary issue of law, marginalization, and justice. We were fortunate to have Disha Wadekar as our inaugural scholar for the year 2022-23. Disha co-taught an elective with Professor Anurag Bhaskar on caste and constitutionality. We were honored to welcome Nikita Sonavane as the 2023-24 scholar to teach a course on policing, caste, and castrality. Both courses have had a deep impact and resonated across the university, enriching the academic experiences for our students, faculty, and the broader community. Through teaching, the scholars have inspired students to critically engage with contemporary issues of law and justice. The scholars also deliver a public lecture that sparked dialogues and debate, fostering a culture of intellectual curiosity and critical engagement. We would like to extend a warm welcome to Nikita Sonavane and look forward to her lecture on caste, castrality, and the digital, and to our wonderful colleague Dhiren for accepting our invitation to serve as a discussant. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor Jain. I'd now like to invite Disha Chaudhary, Clinical Assistant Professor and Assistant Director of CJLS, to introduce the Law and Justice Scholar Program and the lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Firoza. Before I hand over to our speaker for today, I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk you through the journey that Nikita has had as the Law and Justice Scholar for 2023. As Professor Jain mentioned, we introduced this program in 2022 with Disha as the inaugural scholar, and then we've had the privilege of having Nikita as our scholar for 23-24. Nikita's rich experience and learnings as an activist, lawyer, and researcher working on interrogating the relationship between caste, gender, and policing, among other issues, informed the conceptualization of the course she taught on policing, caste, and carcerality in India. This elective was offered to the students at Jindal Global Law School in fall 2023. And when we first offered the course, we got over 200 applicants for an elective that could accommodate up to 30 students. And Nikita continues to be a very, very popular faculty, and we still have requests for her to return to campus at the earliest opportunity possible. So it's been a real privilege to have her. The course focused on, the origins of policing through criminal laws, while also situating its embeddedness in the institution of policing within structures of caste carcerality. It grappled with questions around law, caste, and carcerality. And we concluded the teaching component of the course with a workshop in August where we had the students really deconstruct ideas of decriminalization, what it really means to interact with the law and social sciences. And we've seen a profound impact of Nikita's course in our students, both in the engagement through the workshop and also all of our interactions with them in subsequent courses and clinical courses, where we see students constantly questioning their role as lawyers, the way they engage with the law and its own limitations in furthering structural hierarchies. Today's lecture, which is the flagship lecture as part of the Law and Justice Scholar program, is an attempt to take some of these conversations forward and really look at some of the contemporary challenges that emerge with advancements in technology, which are fast-paced and slowly but gradually beating the development that law is keeping up with. And today's lecture will therefore focus on caste, carcerality, and the digital. We're very fortunate to have Professor Dhiren as the discussant today. And I'm going to hand over to Nikita now for the lecture. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for being here today. I'm a bit daunted because it's my first time at the Taj. So I was like, what is the appropriate outfit to wear? I don't care if you guys are able to grasp anything or not, I must look sharp. That's what I'm here for. But yeah, so I mean, the subject of today's discussion is carcerality and the digital. And the way that we've framed the subject of this discussion, it looks like these are three sort of disparate entities, structures, ideas. But in today's conversation, and of course, having Dhiren here is a huge bonus because somebody whose work I followed very closely and looked up to for a very long time, even though I've only been able to meet them today for the first time. So I'm very excited and also a tad bit nervous, as lawyers should be when they are with people who are trained in real things. Yeah, so I mean, the way that, I want to speak to like how we're thinking about, and I'm thinking about these questions and making meaning of the question of caste, carcerality and the digital. And the way that I'm doing it is, and I keep saying we because this is a framework that my colleagues at the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project and particularly communities that we work with, especially those belonging to erstwhile criminalized communities known as the denotified tribes, among others, have contributed to formulating. So, for me to, like when I share some of these ideas, to say that these are ideas that have been collectively and intergenerationally developed by scores of communities. And so, when we speak about caste, carcerality and digital, we think of it as casteist digital carcerality. And the reason why we think of this as casteist digital carcerality is, situating the origin of carcerality, which is, largely the framework of whether it's the police, and when I say police, I mean policing. It's a distinction that we make between the police as a formal institution, but policing as a praxis, and as a praxis that is in one way enforced through criminal law and criminalization, but also through various other institutions like the family, but fundamentally originating within the institution of caste or Brahmanism. So to see that as that's my entry point and the entry point of my colleagues and I at the CPA project to understanding policing is that it's an entity and as a way of being that is shaped by Brahmanism, and so carcerality in the context of India is caste, and caste is carcerality. So we see these as being synonymous, and the digital as being located within this. So when I say that, it's also pushback against, of course, like this idea of the digital, which at least in the Indian public discourse or imagination has been brought to the forefront through Aadhaar. So that's that kind of formulation to say that Nilekani and his friends are people that inaugurated the realm of the digital to us, and that this is a way of seeing that has brought in different kinds of complexities, or something that we haven't seen before, is the kind of framing that we're pushing back against. Simply to say that what we see technology doing is nothing original, and that the people that made Aadhaar, or all of these different systems that are being developed are not new systems. And the way that we have engaged with this is in the context of policing, and particularly within the framework of data or datafication, because the idea of data collection has been central to the idea of criminality itself. The creation of the category of a criminal, and I don't just mean as a legal category, but also as a sociological category. The creation of a category of, somebody who's an aberration, or as a deviance, which is a word that keeps coming up very often. How this is a category that is constructed through data collection, and I mean, how data collection becomes a way to identify certain groups of people as criminal in nature. So the idea of group criminality is born out of collecting data on various kinds of individuals, right? So people that are committing robberies, people that are committing thefts. So the idea of group criminality is emanating from data collection, but also then the circular logic of data collection, where the identification of certain groups as being criminal in nature then leads to them being datafied, or their bodies being made sites of data, right? So it's that kind of circular logic where the data that you collect allows for this category of the criminal to be constructed, and then that in itself leads you to a better kind of understanding of who a criminal is. And surveillance, the idea of surveillance is something that we root in the creation of this kind of datafied body, right? So the surveilled body is ultimately a datafied body, a body whose movements are mapped, which is what something like the Aadhaar is also doing, right? So whether it's fingerprints, whether it's photographs, whether it's people's behaviors, we see that as being the origin point of surveillance. And a lot of these questions, of course, we'd been thinking about as lawyers representing people from various denotified tribes, and seeing that the life of the police as an institution also extended beyond the formal confines of what criminal law and criminal procedure has laid out, to policing as a way of life. And a huge sort of part of it was the sort of routine process of data collection from people. And we began tracing it, of course, in the context of the erstwhile criminalized tribes with the Criminal Tribes Act, which has created this category of the born criminal. So this idea of criminality being ascribed by birth is also an idea then that comes to life because there are certain ways of being that are used as data points for criminalization or criminality, right? So wandering communities, for instance, a lot of communities that were nomadic in nature or semi-nomadic in nature, hunters, several street performers, entertainers, people that you commonly also know as saperas, so the snake charmers, or madaris. All of these communities, the idea of wandering then being made synonymous with being criminal. And then data points for what the wandering being looks like, or what the wandering family or wandering groups of people look like, then become the sort of grounding for the category of the criminal. And even before that, it's with the idea of, the thuggy, which is like, they say that, it was like the first kind of colonial discovery of group criminality. So the idea of the mob, right? And again, central to this project is, the setting up of what was known as a thuggy and a dacoity department through the maintenance of various registers, recording this data. So as people who are working on this, we were able to see how, in a very sort of systematic way, certain ways of being that are, either at the periphery of the caste system, which was in the case of certain Dalit communities who were criminalized under the Criminal Tribes Act, but also those that did not ascribe to the caste system. So a lot of ethnic communities or tribes. Was that sort of occupational logic, which was one of the logics of criminality, is something then that is used as data. So for us, when we were looking at, seeing conversations around Aadhaar, or also particularly in the last couple of years, with the building of criminal databases. So, with the CCTNS, which is the crime and criminal tracking network system, which is something that was introduced under the guise of saying, this is a platform that is going to be used to make, documents from the criminal justice system publicly accessible, and then sort of becomes a kind of platform that is used to collect data, collect huge amounts of biometric data, and then, subsequent versions of it which are constantly moving towards interlinking various databases and also centralizing them. To us, as people who are doing this work, whether it was the legacy of the Thuggy laws or the Criminal Tribes Act, or its post-colonial version, which are these habitual offenders laws, it was very clear to us that the idea of datafication or the idea of data collection was the common thread, right? So the registered people were now people that had made it to these criminal databases. And we began looking at this in the context of Hyderabad, because Hyderabad is also very uniquely positioned in this particular scenario, because it is considered to be like, of course, after Telangana was formed as a new state, the first thing that they did in Hyderabad was to say that we want to attract, foreign investment and investors, and we want to be able to do this through the maintenance of law and order. And the way that you can maintain law and order is if you have a police that is technologically sound. So the first thing that they did when they were revamping or doing a makeover of the Telangana police is that the police commissioner goes to New York and spends several weeks with the NYPD to say, what, we want to learn from the best. Let's see what you guys do and let's see what we can come back and do here, right? So there were a lot of different things, whether it's through the building of criminal hotspots. And this is also happening. There's a lot of foreign investment that is coming through Silicon Valley-based big tech companies here, right? So Google, Amazon, everybody is interested in, of course, selling all kinds of, clothing items and other things, but also surveillance technologies, right? So really diverse interests these various companies have. And so they walk in and they want to do this. But it's very interesting how Silicon Valley, or the ethos of Silicon Valley, which is a place in the US, somewhere in the Bay Area, California, when it comes to Hyderabad, it becomes Hyderabadi, right? Like the ethos, then Silicon Valley is no longer a place, but it's an idea that travels across borders, and it's an idea that then replicates itself in the ways that Hyderabad has been, where, Muslims are criminalized in a certain way. Tribal Muslims are criminalized in a very specific way. The way that, but so it's, what we were seeing was that this was old wine in a new bottle, right? And this really takes us back to what this really fantastic Black American sociologist called Simone Brown calls. She says, it tells us that surveillance hasn't been inaugurated by technology, right? And when we were interviewing people in Hyderabad, one of the things that we realized is this idea also of people negotiating with technology as looking back at it. So the idea of surveillance is to say, this sort of view from the top, but what Simone Brown calls surveillance, which is looking back. We also saw communities doing that. So this sort of push, which is something that we've also seen in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, which is where we work, is to say, you think you're going to use these dozens of CCTV cameras to record, evidence of our criminality. We will pay to install these CCTV cameras to tell you we're not doing that. So, and to say that actually it's police officers who come here and who harass us. So we're going to deploy this technology to look back at you and to take back what is rightfully ours. And I think it is this sort of gamut of, the logics of technology that have been rooted in the social, in the structural, and in the structure of caste, which is not something, which has been, as most things are, obfuscated within this language of, which tech companies have utilized as being the language of neutrality, but well-meaning lawyers, scholars, activists have shrouded under this sort of casteless idea of privacy, right? To say that, this is a question of privacy, this is a question of, or at best, which is also something that, we've done, is this sort of abstract Foucauldian idea of disciplining, to say that we're creating disciplined bodies without really applying much thought to how these so-called disciplined bodies have also exercised agency as data-fied surveilled bodies, right? And I think that is something in today's conversation I want to be able to explore with Dhiren, because so much of their work has been around, the question of the digital and the space, particularly in the context of caste and queerness. And I think there's a lot to learn from there, and also for us to be able to see some of these technologies in the way that they deserve to be seen as, rooted in this long legacy of the technology of surveillance and the technology of caste. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nikita. It's absolute brilliance. It feels like intimidating to sit next to Nikita and speak after Nikita. But that's also the kind of labor that marginalized communities now who have entered into spaces which have been denied to us for centuries are able to provide and produce, right? And therefore I think as consumers of this knowledge, the Savarnas should actually be grateful. I think we should start with that point that what Adivasi communities, what Bahujan communities are producing, it's out of our generosity that we are doing it. This work should be done by you people. You are the ones who are exploiting and benefiting out of the systems of violence to keep and maintain the status quo in place. Right? So let's start with that and think around it. While listening to Nikita, I was very, very excited and thinking about and so many thoughts were churning in my head, and I was thinking, because I'm a geographer by training, and we talk about carcerality through carceral geographies, and Foucault, when he was talking about carcerality, was talking about carceral archipelago, it's also geography. And so when I am introducing geographies of social pathology to my students, I often ask them to do an activity for me. I ask them to draw an outline map of the city that they live in. Right? And it could be anything. And I don't expect students to be well versed in cartography. Right? None of us are. And cartography is the oldest colonial discipline that could happen. It was devised for extraction. It was devised for colonial expansion. But when students make that outline map, I ask them to map on that, which could be any map, and it's gendered map depending on how we live in cities, what mobility we have, how constrained we are, how it all depends on where we come from. I ask them to map 2 places they find the safest in the city, and 2 places they find the unsafest in the city. Right? And given the kind of composition that academic spaces have been, highly privileged with many people who come from marginalized communities keeping quiet, silenced in the very classrooms that we all teach, only to later on tell you in complete privacy, I'm borrowing that word, to secrecy saying that, oh, but we also come from this community, but nobody should know who we are, right? And you will note that when this safety and unsafety is being mapped on those outlines, it always ends up like some basti is an unsafe place, right? Some ghetto, Jamia Nagar is unsafe. I did the same exercise at Stephen's College last month, and oh no, you know that Jamia Nagar is very unsafe. Who lives in Jamia Nagar? Right? Like, you know, and like, you know. So for them, and it's very interesting, right? At the very moment, not just that geographical place becomes a hotspot or becomes an unsafe terrain where we should not move. It's a psychic narrative that has been reproduced again and again and placed and circulated amongst all of us. Right? What happens to people who are from Jamia Nagar sitting here, or the Tilokpur Basti sitting here, and engaging with that same narrative? That we are simultaneously told that while we are sitting here and talking with you, you're not welcome here. That this continual legacy of caste and coloniality will continue to mark us, our places we live, the places we move around as carceral. And I was thinking about digital, and I was reminded of this 2015 incident in outside Pondi Bazar police station in Chennai. A trans woman was found burnt. She was sorry, I should be giving trigger warnings, but I'm very, very weird about it because nobody gives trigger warnings to marginalized people before doing violence. Nobody gave the trans women a trigger warning. So let's hear about what happens. It is outside police station. The same police infrastructure that has come here has been devised to protect certain kinds of body from certain kinds of bodies, right? To typecasting certain kinds of bodies. And here, this trans woman is burnt alive. She was picked up later in the night on the pretext that she was doing sex work. She's brought, she might be loitering around, but you know, certain kinds of people can't even loiter around, can't even move around, right? And that needs to be controlled. So she's of course picked up by the police, she's harassed. You do not know what happens in a police station. Like some people can get easy lawyer coming in, rescuing you, you know, like Delhi people love telling, no, janta mera baap kaun hai? Many of us can't do that, janta mera baap kaun hai, right? Because my baap to sarkar hai, my baap to brahman hai, my baap to jat hai, right? And therefore, within that system, how can you survive this? And this trans woman later on gets out, she burns herself, self-immolation happens. Now, CCTV camera, which is put there for surveilling, maintaining law and order, suddenly becomes dysfunctional. Then inside a police custody, how did a trans woman find petrol to burn herself? It was not a petrol station, it's a police station. Of course, they petrol in different forms. But that's what I'm thinking alongside Nikita to think about. That even though this technology, and what she said, the neutrality of this technology, the surveillance mechanism that is produced, and it has been much more vivid since the carceral turn and this punitive turn that we are witnessing when we study criminology, etc., that has come to define this implementation of technology as much hyper implementation in order to protect our lives, in other words. That how it is so conditioned. That it will be used only to protect, not just protect people, protect a certain kind of narrative that is deeply embedded into caste histories. Right? And while we're thinking about anti-carcerality, like from like black feminists, abolition feminist thinkers who think about racial capitalism, and that's one very interesting thing Nikita's work does about thinking about it, not just in racial capitalism, but also thinking about caste capitalism. And how that engagement produces these framings within which one is trying to think about our lives and living them too. Right? And I'm also thinking about what Nikita talks about in terms of the caste carceral panopticon. And like, you know, what is this panopticon? Who is watching us? And why are we being watched? Especially for queer people, because we also police our desires a lot of times, because whom we can desire, whom we cannot desire is also coming from that point. I'm also thinking about the kind of work, because data came in, and I wanted to bring in Abhay Khaka here, the brilliant Adivasi scholar who says, I'm not your debtor. And it's a kind of both that rejection, refusal that we are trying to do of the policing mechanism that is being implemented on all of us. Thinking about the history and legacy of coloniality, modernity, and thinking about Criminal Tribes Act itself, part 1 of the CTA that Nikita talked about. I also want to bring in like part 2 of the CTA Act, where UNAC as a category is brought into the picture, but also the same kind of district registers are being maintained with hyper detailed. And Jessica Hinchey writes about it, right? You want to know how much property do they have. You want to know where do they live. You want to know what to do. And you can criminalize them on just reasonable suspicion. I do not know this legal thing about reasonableness of suspicion. Very unreasonable is this reasonable reason. Or maybe the reason is rooted in caste, and that's why it's so unreasonable to many of us. Right? To think about what do this datification does, and what Abhay Khaka says that I'm not your data. That I do not want to be reduced into your data. Right? It's a challenging that system of violence. I want to also bring in another poet, Sukita Rani, who writes in Tamil, brilliant poet. But she talks about where is all of this knowledge production coming from, and she writes that in their minds, and I'm like, who are these people who keep on thinking about our lives? In their minds, I who smell faintly of meat. Because somebody who lives in Jamia Nagar or in Tilakpur Basti looks like some smells in a particular way. In their minds, I who smell faintly of meat, in our houses where bones hang bereft of any flesh, and on our streets where young boys wander without restraint, making loud music strung to coconut shells stuck to their skin. In their minds, these are all at the far end of the village. But I keep assuring them that we are at the forefront. And I think that's what Nikita was trying to say, that you're countering this idea of surveillance, to thinking about, we are going to throw back onto you. Like, you are not going to narrate and define our life worlds and typecast us in particular fashions, that we are going to undo, rupture and repair as decolonial practice asks us, to rupture your system of knowledge production and repair it where it becomes inclusive and egalitarian, not just for the namesake of being inclusive and egalitarian, because it's very fashionable to be anti-caste these days, and trendy, to actually doing that work rather than just speaking about it like most post-colonial scholars did for the longest period of time. Yeah.
While being casteless.
While being casteless. But being person of color, right? Because you have to hold on to some marginality, right? But you can't say that I'm also Brahmin, right? I'm also coming from southern dominant caste background, because that helps you. That doesn't look good in your SOPs, right? Or your diversity statements. Right? But we are more than our diversity statements. We are life worlds full of knowledges, life worlds and knowledges that are challenging the ways in which society has been organized so far, that how we are pathologized, and what new worlds and new life forms we can think through. I do not know in COVID, this incident, this Kusumpur Basti, Kusumpur Pahadi, have you heard of it? People living in Delhi. It's one of the largest bastis in Delhi. It's mostly inhabited by SC, ST, OBC people. Right now, it's in Vasant Vihar, and Vasant Vihar at least right? What places we know, what places we do not know. So Kusumpur Pahadi Basti is next to the central government employees' housing. So all this Airport Authority of India, their employees, all of people live there. Now in COVID, because the state infrastructure told us to be careful, vigilant about who is doing what, we should not spread the virus. Like sometimes bachao thali, or sometimes like do gali on people who are like wandering around. Right? कि कहीं रमजान पे कपड़े खरीदने तो नहीं निकल गए हैं लोग. Now, this few people at the Kusumpur Pahadi Basti were detected positive for COVID. Now, before the state could come into picture, this central government employees housing wanted to protect themselves. So they constructed an informal wall, a wall between the Basti and them, so obstructing the only way they could actually reach the main road. So you are basically ghettoizing them. Like carcerality की बात कर रहे हैं ना हम लोग. So you have just incarcerated them into that Basti area. This is what your world is. This is where we want to control the pathogen. But because for us, you are nothing different than the virus. You are both pathologized and the pathogen. Right. So you're obstructed there. Now the curious thing that I want to think about it, that all of these central government employees, who are of course richer than them, are more privileged than them, right? All their houses, people who come to clean their toilets, to keep the hygienic, all come from those buses. people who actually are supposed to help you, that you do not contact any of these diseases, are coming from the bastis, but for you, they are themselves the people. And therefore, what the youth of the basti did, they broke that informal wall and released themselves from it. And that's what we need to do about it. It's like, abolition feminists tell us that, police was itself supposed to be reformed. How would you reform police? Like, how can you reform a system which is supposed to be reformed but has been so violent and racialized? Right? And if it has been so casteist here, how can we create a much more smarter policing mechanism, more effective policing mechanism, thinking that there is a way out of this entrenched caste bias that we think about and live with? I think I've spoken too much. And,
So just 2-3 things, lots of actually from what Dhiryan has said. But I think one is, what you said about the burning of the trans woman. It actually reminds me of how eunuchs, as they were called, or hijras, came to be termed as criminals under the CTA. It was through the murder of a trans woman. And actually, even though the trans woman in the case was a victim, what it did was really brought to light all of these activities, quote unquote activities, that were conducted by trans women. Like saying these are kidnappers. The tolis come, take children away. There's castration. They're engaging in unnatural prostitution. So all of that then becomes the basis for saying this is deviant sexuality. And then the deviant sexuality then becomes the basis for identifying more trans communities, and bringing them within the fold of the CTA. And I want to, what you ended with is the question of bias, and I want to come to that a little bit by also speaking about how record keeping is, and the idea of, data, like, as very often, like when it comes to policing, there is this sort of understanding that there is bias in the system. So it's like, when you think of it within the context of, like, say, a computer, you will say, acha, isme virus hai, so now we just have to debug this system, right? So that's the kind of approach towards policing, to say that this is a system that needs to be debugged, and the bug here is the bias. And when one looks at what is the origin story of this bias, one looks at record keeping, and Radha Kumar's work, Police Matters, is a great example of this, where she's speaking about, her record keeping, this kind of extensive record keeping, which is of, verbal, non-verbal cues, like things like there was a dictionary that a police officer had put together in Punjab of words that various quote-unquote criminal communities use in Punjab. Things about, like certain communities using certain kinds of hand gestures, like the bhamtas being like, these are hand gestures. Now, for me, as somebody who grew up in Maharashtra, bhamta was a word that was just used as a synonym for a crook, or somebody who was dishonest, or even, words like kanjar, like, which is very commonly used in North India as a slur. Like, we never made these associations with various communities, and that these were criminalized communities, right? Or even like the very sort of direct legacy of the CTA and the habitual offenders provisions, where like the registers now are known as history sheets or gunda registers, so much so that gunda or rowdy is just a really common way of describing somebody who's, not a decent person, or who's not civilized, right? Or who doesn't fit within that society. And that this, like when Radha Kumar writes about colonial Madras, she's speaking about how, they're maintaining these registers, or these bad character roles, or history sheets, or gunda registers. And this begin documenting this, and of course this is like, record keeping that they also need to do, that when police officers are transferred, then when the new police officer comes in, this is something that is handed over to them. But she speaks about how, in this process of identifying these castes, the category becomes the caste itself. So there's a register, which is a Marava register, and the Maravas in Madras and Tamil Nadu are a dominant caste community. So, I mean, now dominant caste OBC, but at that time at odds with other communities. So there's a Marwa register which is just information about the Marwas. So she's also speaking about how, so much of while caste communities and groups are being shaped by the collection of data, the police's own understanding of caste and their own caste politics is also evolving as they're learning more, right? So so much of obviously, each time there is an act of police violence, there is a Savarna liberal public conscience which is immediately weaponized or, moved to saying, this galvanization to say, oh, these are people that are overworked, they're understaffed. I mean, it was always meant to be an understaffed force, and it's not even understaffed, is because it's a smart force, right? So because you're not policing everybody. Each time there is an offense that is registered, each time quote unquote a crime happens, the police knows which basti to go to. They will walk in, they will go exactly where they've always been going to. And that's how policing resources have always been utilized and targeted. And in her work, she talks about how districts in rural Madras were reorganized on the basis of who needed to be policed. So to say that, look, let's put put these guys in this one district, and let us then see, we can then police them more effectively, right? Or trade routes being changed because certain communities needed more protection from certain other kinds of communities. So this kind of moving around of the police and policing has always been associated with certain communities, certain spaces, and the idea of loitering and wandering is very central to it. And I've thought about because when you look at the Criminal Tribes Act, it was something that was also used in France. It was used also in some British colonies. If one looks at some East African countries, also the Criminal Tribes Act was there, and the idea of itinerancy or wandering constantly keeps coming up. So what is it about he or her or them, those who are not settled, or the idea of people who are loitering, which is so at odds with being able to control people, right? To say that we need to put them in a place, and that certain people moving around is a threat, right? Certain people accessing spaces or certain people being a certain way is a threat. In Hyderabad, during the pandemic 2021, they launched this campaign called Mission Chabutra. Chabutra basically being this sort of area of congregation in any basti where Muslim youth who were deemed as wandering Muslim youth, so young boys who are hanging out with their friends at the end of the day, they would be rounded up and their fingerprints would be taken, and then you would see that if these people have a criminal record, so to be able to then do that mapping. And this idea that how this idea of how the wandering tribes now has evolved, and we are seeing the same thing now coming back to the wandering Muslim youth, and to say that, look, we need your data in order to be able to make sure that your movements are restricted, right? And so many of these wandering communities are also communities that are engaged in occupations that one would now commonly understand as being part of the unorganized workforce or the informal labor, right? So scores of occupations, whether it is working with animals, whether it is hunting, whether it's something like street performing, people that are making medicine. So a host of these occupations. So one kind of rationale of it is economic control, to be able to say that you want to be able to keep these people in tabs. And some of our work at the CPA project speaks to how communities, particularly tribes that are have traditionally made alcohol and certain traditional kinds of alcohol are heavily policed and criminalized, because them making alcohol is seen as a threat to people that are monopolizing the manufacture and sale of liquor in this country, right? So you're seeing that at being odds with certain forms of resource appropriation and resource control. But I also think something more fundamentally, I think there is this idea of a marginalized person moving around freely and taking up space is one that causes a lot of anxiety. And I think that anxiety is the anxiety of policing, right? To say that this is a person when they move around, in so many ways, the moving around also perhaps symbolizes to those in power the shifting of power balances, right? Just people occupying spaces, accessing spaces, or just the fact that a bunch of, Muslim men can sit and own up space and have a good time with their friends, right? I think it's a threat to the idea of the victim, the idea of a body that needs to be controlled, the idea of a body that needs to be datafied, right? People taking up space, which is why so much of anti-caste scholarship and anti-caste struggle, as much as, the goal of the state and status projects is to ensure that people are constantly caught up in survival, but marginalized people are always thinking about, ways to reclaim their personhood, right? And which is tied to the idea of thriving and taking up space literally and figuratively. So which is why land struggles or struggles to resources are all, Jal Jangal Zameen, which is what a lot of Adivasi communities, which has been their struggle historically. It's a struggle of taking up space and owning space and exercising your right over spaces that have been yours. And so much of policing is constructed around making sure that that space is not taken up. And so data, therefore, of certain ways of being as being at odds with the status quo then comes to be read into as bias, right? So the way that we push back against it is to say that, it's not the bias that has crept into the system, when in fact what is predominantly understood as being the bias is actually the system, right? So that is policing. And therefore, when all of these formulations, particularly, mostly technocratic formulations, are heavily borrowed, like the other way that a lot of people think that caste can be made meaning of is by drawing, irresponsible parallels with race, right? Which happens very, very often. And the POC obviously being central to that project. But there's one of the terms that has come in is the idea of predictive policing. But as people who have had the misfortune of engaging with the question of policing for a very long time, to us it's just policing, because there is no predictive element involved in it. So the criminal hotspot is always the basti, right? And the this kind of facial recognition is always the way that certain kinds of being or certain forms of appearances, which is known as biometric data, which is tied to the appearance of certain kinds of community, dark skin, or like with the Pardhis to say, oh, these are people that have brown eyes, and these are people that are more likely to commit crime. It's what the algorithm is telling you. So, this is, to us, what we're seeing as playing out in this digital form, that so much effort is being put into to unpack, as if it's an innovation that the police has stumbled upon, which obviously gives them an extraordinary amount. Oh, wow. So, should I exit, okay?
चालू हो गया.
Biometric.
The irresponsible, you started the irresponsible marriage between caste and race, and how.
Yeah, facial recognition is, you're seeing that it's always, the algorithm has always been just policing. It's like, if one looks at the origin story of policing, in India, it started from the village watchman, the village headman, which are the dominant castes or the Brahmins of the village, right? To then saying, for various reasons, it evolving. One is saying we need a separate military force. Secondly, some of these dominant caste people joining the nationalist movement. But, various sort of configurations then leading to the institutionalizing of the police force as we understand it today, right? But policing has always been that kind of, institutionalization of caste-based hierarchies. And that has always been the origin story of policing. So to think about policing and to think about how, speaking of the bias in the policing or thinking about reforming policing is akin to saying that there is a way to reform caste, right? There's a way to make it less violent, whether through sensitization, or there's a way to make it less insidious through technology, right? So, but what we are seeing is the same system that is playing out in different forms, but because, there is part of it is, of course, the lethargy of doing that kind of historical work, but part is, and a significant part of it is also this kind of collective sort of denial of caste. And because when we speak about policing, and very often when I was teaching the course at Jindal and when kids came to my class, the first day I had to tell them is, look, if you walked into my class, hoping to hear about what is happening to oppressed caste communities in the country, the door is wide open. Because what we are interested in and what policing is, it's a project of Brahmanism. And therefore, what we are trying to unpack is not the lives of oppressed caste communities and criminalized communities, is to understand the DNA of Brahmanism through policing. And so that is, and I think that sort of collective investment in not understanding or divesting from Brahmanism is what is leading us to seeing, the digital as a new phenomena. And so, like, even in Hyderabad, and I want to, stop there, one of the first things that the Hyderabad, the Telangana state government did is when, Telangana was formed as a separate state, is put the entire state into a lockdown and conduct what was known as a family survey. So it was called the Kutumbak Samagra survey, which was supposed to be a sort of civic survey, and there was data that was collected along 94 parameters, where do you live, what kind of house do you own, so on and so forth. So the idea was to build a family tree of various people. And 4 years later, they conducted what is called a comprehensive criminal survey, so collecting data on professional offenders, who these quote-unquote professional offenders are, what do they do, so on and so forth. And then, very interestingly, both the family data and this data were housed out of the police department. It was not housed out of the MHA, it was not housed out of, any other department, it was housed out of the police department. So this sort of mapping of the criminal families, right, to say that this is intergenerational, to say that this occupationality is also, intergenerational, is also speaking to how the family, this has always been a project of the criminalization of the family, right? So group criminality has always been tied to familial criminality. And familial criminality, or the construction of the family, has always been a casteist construct. Or those who are seen as lying outside of the institution of family, or as a transgression to the institution of family, as trans people are seen as in many ways, are then seen as being a threat to the status quo, right? So, policing or criminalization is the project of the family. So family policing in so many ways, which is why a lot of policing in the way that one, will see with the love jihad laws or, the conversion laws is, or also the sort of denial or the refusal of the state to get into, to be involved in the space of the home, right? Whether it's through marital rape, etc. So that kind of policing serving as a way to entrench the structure of the family is where a lot of these ideas of policing even emerge from, right? Which is where the idea of the criminal tribe as being a hereditary criminal, and as a hereditary criminal of people belonging to the same family as generational criminals, while some other are, generational intellectuals. That is an idea that you are seeing as being replicating, and that is what they would say in whatever millennial or Gen Z terms, I don't know, but OG policing, right? So I think to be able to see that in that light, and to be able to see the Hyderabad model that is being replicated across India today, and one that they learned also from the NYPD, is that they learned certain ways of racialized being through the NYPD. It was not the technology. It was not the technology that the Hyderabad police traveled all the way to New York for. It was a way to think about how racialized policing can find itself, in terms of drawing those kind of parallels, and not the kind of lazy parallels that usually happen between caste and race, but to think about what can be meaningful ways to learn from that kind of experience and to bring it back home to Hyderabad, and then to see ways of replicating it across India.
Thank you again, Nikita. Yeah. It's honestly like, you talk about like upper caste people are married, like they're shit, nothing. But they've been like selling mediocrity as married for forever. But I was also thinking, because I was going back to what Nikita had started, like coming to Taj and sitting here and talking about all of this thing. The last time I came to Taj was when Facebook was hosting, the South Asian Facebook network was hosting a group meeting where they had representatives from across South Asian countries, except Pakistan, of course. There was not really, like, even from Afghanistan, they did not have a Muslim representative. So it was a very strange kind of concoction. When they were talking about how to strengthen the community guidelines. So much of hate speech is happening. Otherwise Facebook is like the best place to be. All these social media platforms are like very objective, cruelty-free, right? And let's close down hate speech. Now, all they were talking about, they were circle and circle telling how great they were, patting their backs. Well, they said, they're not hiring people who are community moderators. They were saying like, we will not hire on the basis of diversity that is required. Because a lot of people who are moderating those hate speech reporting that you do not even understand the violence. So if somebody would say कि तुम अपना काम छोड़ो, वापस से जूते सिलना शुरू कर दो. Like for people who have gone through that history who understand, so caste is this. But for them who are moderating it would not find it violent. So last time I was here, this all was happening, and timidly as I am sometimes, I like with stuttering voice towards the end raised my hand to say, because I was part of this bunch of Dalit feminists, mostly women and queer people who were doing this study that how to control the hate speech, and how hate speech moderation is so caste coded. We're talking about algorithms, right? And we had been reporting again and again, finding out these pages that produce those hate, and we've been reporting several of this which get deleted, but then they're brought back because they does not violate community guidelines. And I remember in my stuttering voice I had mentioned at that time something which I felt very offensive, and I feel everybody in this room should find violent and offensive. And I said, but Facebook does not find it violent or hate speech, so maybe I can say it. And for the very genteel audience that was there, they could not digest it. Like nobody made eye contact with me after that. And I don't want to repeat it because it was extremely violent. It was about minority women bodies, how they can be mutilated, and that's the way in which you will fight that community. Right now, political leaders also say such things. They are not criminalized, but marginalized people have to be criminalized. But I'm also thinking around that while that was happening here, the legacy is, as Nikita is telling us, is so far and wide. It's like, the idea of the habituated. Like even we are talking about 377 or 377 chala gaya. It all started with habituated sodomite. The idea of the habit. Aadat hai, lat hai inki. Right? And therefore, because they can't be disciplined, their deviant bodies, they need to be engaged into this punitiveness. Right? They need to be punished and disciplined in that form. I don't know, because most of you are lawyers, I assume. Have you read Manual of Medical Jurisprudence? It's a very exciting document, and I think it should be taught in law schools, for sure. It's a colonial document, right? And it is produced after it's before the 377 comes into picture, and it's also the second edition comes after the Criminal Trials Act has come into picture. Right? And how this Manual of Medical Jurisprudence is trying to tell us how to find it, because Nikita was talking about racialization of the bodies, communities, tribes, and typecasting them. It talks about who are these people who are habituated in doing such kind of things, such kind of sexual activities, which is eunuchs, unnatural sex offenders. Like they do it because they're outside the disciplinary boundary of the family, as Nikita mentioned. Now, this all is happening after 1857. Revolt has happened. Muslims, which had power at one point of time in the history, have lost all the favor because now the colonial masters see them as threat. They were the one, Bahadur Zafar, under the leadership of Bahadur Zafar and the Nawabs, you're fighting against the British Empire. So, replacement, massive replacement happens. So if you look at the Manual of Medical Jurisprudence, there's a 5-page in that, of course, there's all kinds of crime, on unnatural sex. And that's the most exciting piece. And how jurisprudence is so fictional. How medicine is so fictional, despite the fact, you keep on claiming how objective reality science is so objective. And it specifically targets and says, look at this, Muslims, they're habituated at doing this unnatural sex. Go to Punjab, and because Punjab had so much of resistance at that time, go to Punjab and look at these Punjabis, Punjabis think, and because native informants, native doctors, they're specialists. Right? Who are these ones? Like the headsmen, the Zamindar, the Brahmin lord. These native doctors have told us that these Punjabis think that if they have sex with a goat, they can cure gonorrhea. That Gorkhas like to have sex with ponies. So therefore we have killed most of them. And it goes on to say, look at the street in Lucknow, all of these, and that's hot spotification, right? Typecasting and regimenting and disciplining these places. These entire people this bunch of houses have been taken over by eunuchs, and now they are practicing unnatural prostitution. Look at your archives after archives is this identification. So what Facebook is trying to do, and it's not able to see the hate in the hate speech that is being propagated, is because it wants to speak with power, and the only way capitalism is here, as neoliberalism says, it doesn't judge in that sense. But the way it can function is to have this easy, important synchronization with the politics of power, right? And that's what decolonial scholars have been calling coloniality of power. And as anti-car scholars, we are trying to say, while coloniality of power as a concept might have erupted in Latin America through Peruvian scholarship, indigenous scholarship from Argentina, when it comes to India and we are thinking through it, we can't think it outside the logic of Brahminism. And therefore, when the colonial powers came in, they wedded with Brahminical logic in order to substantiate their disciplining process, to control people's bodies. Like, to be reasonably suspicious of certain bodies just because they are wearing a sari and dancing and singing in corners. And these are threatening to the system. It's threatening to families. It's threatening to the caste system. Right? It's threatening to the power that the colonial want to imagine. Often I ask, I once asked my grandmother, who is close to 100 years old now, and asked her, you must have witnessed 1947. It must be such an historic moment. You must be young and chirpy, India's getting independence, it's fun, Britishers are going with bye-bye British, right? All of that fun things are happening. She said, nobody told us the British were leaving. All they knew was, now, the Darbar will not have power on our lives. Now what is this Darbar? This infrastructure of the Darbar, which is caste. It's a caste feudal order which is deeply tied to Brahminical logic, right? To the colonial power. The handful of Britishers, you go to England and you see this tiny island, how did they rule all the world? Right? The handful of these Britishers were able to rule us is because they were partisan with the people who were in power. And they were letting them in power, only to the extent that the very people in power felt like, now we feel threatened and now we have to do independence struggle. But for her, she's like, we are not independent. We are not free. We cannot be free unless this system of Darbar, which they all know it continues to rule our lives, ceases to exist. And that's what we are trying to work with and think through while we are having this conversation. I think we can open this conversation for questions. The original idea was to make it conversational. It's not, the burden is not ours to talk about this.
Yeah, thank you for both of you for the immense amount of learning you've been able to provide us for today. I had two questions actually. The first one was, Nikita, you spoke about how anti-caste struggles rotate around occupying space both metaphorically and physically, and the reclamation of goods, of almost common goods and common resources, the reclamation of that. I just want to know, in the context of technology currently, with how data is viewed as a good nowadays, do we have an analogous thing to how oppressed communities are trying to almost reclaim data as well? And the second question I had was to both was that in how caste and carcerality is working with the police, does it work synonymously in how corporations behave punitively in context of the surveillance of their employees? So, like for example, how urban crap, etc., how the surveillance they conduct on their employees is done with very strictly punitive measures in their mind. I just want to know, is it synonymous in any way to how the police are doing, or the way corporations are doing that, is that a completely different direction? Thank you.
Okay, we can take two more.
Thank you for such insightful words, and to the organizers for live streaming the lecture. That was quite helpful. You mentioned Bhopal, where you work, right? So close to Bhopal is also the Kuno Park, the Cheetah Reserve, right? Which is also working in a very interesting context of conservation-induced displacement, which, unlike development forced displacement, is very hard to sort of work with in terms of the affect it has. Within that, what ends up happening is a lot of fieldwork there shows that how the forest officers and the police, like the local level police and the guards, who end up often being posited as these oppositional individuals than in comparison with the dispossessed individuals, are equally frustrated from the work that's going on. One, they are saying that stop bringing more cheetahs, but they're also equally frustrated with the kind of violence that goes on them. From that, I actually want to borrow that police in itself, in its organogram, is a deeply casteist structure, right? What kind, are there any insights that you'd like to sort of share on casteism within the police, right? Within the hierarchy that goes on? And can that be an interface for us to sort of build, for lack of a better word, solidarities and to think of action? A more complicated question actually comes from my past work in cruising, and that's why I'm really glad that Helene is here. One thing is the Criminal Tribes Act, but another thing also is the Eunuchs Act. And I'm glad you mentioned Hyderabad, because there's also the Telangana Eunuchs Act, right? Which has been repealed now, fortunately. To also think of how the mobility of the deviant body or the deviant subject becomes all the more hard to sort of contend with the more one is interested in political action when one talks about cruising culture and public sexuality, right? Which becomes almost essential to the way we look at queerness in global South, we might want to look at it. That affective articulation of politics becomes all the more difficult. And I'm deeply concerned about this because just today I think I was reading the news about some entrepreneur wanting to use AI technology to help Delhi police, figure out criminals and do that. Lastly, and this is what I'll end with, right? That I think where we are at in queer politics, trans politics, is that death often becomes the foundation on which we build our politics, right? We build our affect on trans death. Rarely do we talk about trans joy and queer joy. But that's also because trans death is far more spectacular than trans joy, right? And politics is often a work of affect, particularly in this regime. How does one sort of sit with these tensions? What kind of future one does imagine? Does one imagine a radically different future? Or does one try to contend with this and somewhat escape the system? I don't know if I made sense, but that's largely where I'm at here.
Yeah, I think the question that you asked about, how people are able to use like data as a way to resist, right? Or not just resist, but also maybe salvage, reclaim. And this is something that Dakshin Chhara, who's a playwright and a filmmaker from the Chhara community, which is denotified tribe in Gujarat. He said this, and which is what he said that like a lot of the denotified tribes are spread across administrative categories, right? So unlike Dalits that are predominantly in the scheduled caste category, these are communities that are scattered across categories, and also. Because of obviously the lack of census data and caste census data, like these kind of deliberate ways to suppress certain kinds of data collection by the state, these communities are not documented. So whether it's in Bhopal, where the Parthi communities are obviously constantly criminalized, but the state administration will say these people don't exist here because they were put in the general category in 2002. So, so Dakshin was speaking about how there was land, that the Chara community had been, occupying and staying on for a very long time, and the municipal corporation wanted to take over that land, and they said, if you are here, you need to be able to show some documents. And the thing with a lot of nomadic and wandering communities is that there is no documentation, right? Whether it's birth, whatever, like what is regular, also documentation among other marginalized communities is harder to do when you're nomadic in nature or you're moving around. And so they didn't have any other kind of documentation, but what they did have were FIRs. Because there were FIRs that were constantly filed against people from the Chara community, which mentioned that address where they were residing and saying, this person has been arrested from here for alcohol, so on and so forth. So they were able to use that in the High Court to say, look, there are so many FIRs that have been registered against us consistently for so many years, and this is proof of the fact that we've been here. So not only were they able to use police data, but they were also able to turn it on its head to then assert their rights and assert basically their existence, which is also something that, as lawyers, as people from communities, that is this kind of alternate documentation. I mean, it's not alternate documentation, but when somebody is being confined in police custody, there's violence. So the kind of documentation that you create of what has happened, it's an alternate data to what the police is, going to write in the FIR and is going to write in the charge sheet, right? So that is the kind of documentation which is then evidence of what had happened and what this person has experienced. So I think these are ways in which people have been, even within the framework of, what is quote unquote understood as being juridical truths or status narratives, been able to, reclaim their own narratives or reclaim what is their truth. And also, in many ways, the existence of their identities themselves, right? As in the case of the Charas of Charanagar. About the police, okay. So, one is, I want to start by responding to that question by saying that, the police force in India, very often there is this sort of critique of, especially after the 26/11 attacks in Bombay, there was a lot of this criticism that happened around, that these terrorists showed up with really sophisticated weaponry, and the Mumbai police was there with lathis, and so the figure of the policeman with the lathi was constantly deployed, and it's also consistently being deployed in a way to say that this is a police force that is not sophisticated, this is a police force that is, not, because they are not adequately, supplied with weaponry, therefore they're, not being able to do their job well, right? But what this kind of characterization constantly misses out is that the strength of policing in India or the police force in India does not lie in their ability to be able to use sophisticated weaponry or being able to use that. I mean, that seldom happens, which is true of policing across the board. Is basically their embeddedness within the community, right? And one way that they're able to embed themselves within the community is by hiring at the lower rungs, right? Or in the way that you were speaking about is native informants. So this kind of hiring from within the community is a great way to remain relevant in the community and also be able to mediate people's everyday lives, right? Like very often a lot of what the police is doing is mediating interpersonal conflicts, and interpersonal conflicts is मेरे पड़ोसी ने जो भी कर दिया, हमारा झगड़ा हो गया, मेरे बच्चे को मार दिया. So people have gone to the police, and these are people from criminalized communities. So now we filed FIRs and counter FIRs against each other. And so what happens there is that they're able to continue the cycle of criminalization while also mediating themselves as, like family-like structures there, right? To say, we're going to be able to address the conflict. Or if like a woman has walked into the police station to say, look, my husband is violent, he doesn't give money at home, whatever, then there will be, depending on who the husband is to be able to say, look, ispe 498A lagayenge, let's have him in prison. Even if she doesn't want 498A, it's not that. But to say, look, incarceration is a way of addressing this here, because then it also has the possibility of creating a ripple effect within the community. Or there are other ways in which, if it's a Muslim woman or a Hindu woman who wants to marry a Muslim man, then to mediate and say, जाओ अपने माँ बाप के पास, जो माँ बाप बोल रहे हैं वो करो, and follow what they're saying, right? So I think the strength of the police is in this sort of everydayness of people's lives, which is also why the structure of the police force then resembles the structure of, in many ways, the caste hierarchy, where those at the entry point, who are also people that exercise actually the most amount of discretion within the force by virtue of their proximity to people, right? It's one of the few institutions where the person at the lowest end of the hierarchy is the person that has the maximum amount of discretion in what they can do, the beat cop or the forest guard and all of that, right? So I think it's important to understand that this kind of community dynamic is a very deliberate and actively thought of way to replicate caste hierarchies within the police force. And therefore, I think if one is able to build any kind of solidarity with, honestly, of course, if you ask me if solidarity with the police can be built, my answer is a resounding no. But if there is any version of solidarity that can be done, it's solidarity through, the sort of project or the understanding of how certain marginalized caste bodies have been deployed and have been weaponized by the project of policing, right? Or the security state project also, where the paramilitary forces like the CRPF, BSF, etc. will always have people belonging to certain communities, right? Or like what happened with the Salwa Judum also in Chhattisgarh, it was a very sort of active, co-opting and, drawing of people within the state's insurgency and militancy and security state project. So I think it's just important to understand how marginality is also weaponized, or the politics of, as they would like to call, diversity, equity, inclusion. Like the police are flag bearers of that. Like they understood it much better, or like much before any of these corporate entities understood them. They've been doing DEI for years now. The project of diversity is something that they're very good at, and they do it very, very strategically. So I think one is to be able to understand their placement within the force, but also to be then cautious of not seeing them as part of the apparatus, right? It's important to see these individuals or people as being a part of that apparatus, because that's how their existence has been deployed even within that sort of infrastructure of policing or carcerality.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I love talking about cruising. Cruising is my favorite topic. But yeah, I was thinking, because you started with Hyderabad, and I was immediately thinking about this character called Venkat. I don't know if you know about this person. This person has been on rounds and rounds, stalking trans women, murdering them, beating them up, raping them, and across Hyderabad. And there have been again and again, trans people have gone, complained against this person. This person gets arrested, then gets released, and gets back to his business. And that's what I want to think about, why are we so obsessed and why does our heart melt only when we hear of death? And I think it's deeply rooted in the necropolitical ally gaze that we have. And that's something that as people coming from communities that have been killed, murdered, bullied, beaten up, we are not here to be martyrs. This martyrdom is a Savarna concept. They are obsessed with this idea. And we are not here to die, and we don't need to die for your heart to melt. Rohit Vemula doesn't need to die for you to suddenly realize that, education system is violent. Right? A trans woman need not be murdered for you to understand that, we are being so transphobic in our society. And measure the beauty of our communities is the way in which we have been resilient and surviving despite the violence. Learn from that resilience. Learn from those stories of joy and happiness and partying and having fun despite losing your job as a Safai Karmachari. Like, we do not need, and that's something that I totally resound from what you said, our joys are that beautiful. And yet our deaths are only an ingredient for your consumption, because that makes you feel good about yourself and feel sad and sorry for us. We are not somebody to feel sorry about. Actually, we are somebody you should learn from. And then introspect and reflect upon your own internalized systemic biases that you've come to embody. And thinking about cruising, and I was reminded of this story when I was doing my fieldwork many years back. Now I'm very old. When I used to be a doctoral student, and I was studying this very prominent cruising site in Delhi. It's near a women's college, hardly 500 meters away, near a metro station. It's a very, very glorious night. If you go post 6 o'clock, you will see you're watching live porn. Right? It's that active. These are public toilets, right? Now, these are also sites which police know about. And the police frequents these spaces. You could see a policeman just stationed somewhere across the road. Right? And it's interesting because once I had gone and I did not know much about this scene, staying only in JNU where I was studying, and I was wearing this nice floral red shirt with a bow tie, clearly did not belong there. Like all of these people who are actually doing cruising, because they are also marked through their class and caste locations. Right? They are bus conductors, they are rickshaw pullers, they are coolies, they are all those kinds of people which are not sophisticated enough. They don't go to depot and party on Pink Thursdays. Right? They actually go and do cruising, and that's how they survive the sexuality and sexual practice. Right? And here, I am there and watching, what the wonderful world is this? This is freedom. Like, regardless of what 377 is, and still in the paper, still in the law books, people are doing what they want to do. Right? And I'm watching it, and suddenly I see this 12 people jam-packed small public toilet has a hustle bustle. People are running away. Like, people are jumping off the park wall, people are running away, and I'm like, suddenly what happened? And I turn around, there's a police constable standing behind. And I'm like, oh, what am I supposed to do now? Right? But I know that the police there is policing certain kinds of bodies. The way I am dressed, I do not belong there. I might be somebody who was traveling, did not think about how much water I drank, and now my bladder is heavy, I need to pee. So I'm accidentally in that space. The police is not looking for me. Police there to surveil and police the desire of these bodies. Right? But the beauty is not the police came, the people run away. That 15 minutes later, I come back to that spot. People are again doing the same thing. Then I asked, what? Aren't you afraid of the police? Police constable was just here. He must be somewhere around here. Right? And they said, police ko lagta hai, police powerful hai. But we are playing with them. It's not performative. Like, they think they're powerful. Like, usko lagta hai ki they know that state has failed. They know that all the power is coming from the khaki vardi that they're wearing. So we give them the pleasure that they feel powerful. So we see us, we see the vardi, we run away. Right? And when that vardi is gone, the person is gone, he's happy with himself, we come back. But they also know that this language of playfulness can turn violent any moment. Right? The police might not want to just see the performance of their power, but would want to be exploitative. They can ask for oral pleasure or extraction of money. And that's the reason why we were representing queerness in the courtrooms and and we are patting our backs because 377 is gone. We do not want stories of sex workers and trans sex workers and coatis who do cruising, who are low class people, to enter into the courtroom, because that does not relate to Chandrachud's Gymkhana Club friends. When you see Keshav Suri, 5-star hotel, Ritu Dalmia, a 5-star chef, then you get relatable people, our people. Non-reserved. I know IIT merit students also, no? And all of these people are somebody we should cater to. We should fight for them. How can they suffer in a country? Right? So it will only matter, even this myth of trickle down, it will never happen because Venkat is still running free and trans women are still being attacked. While we are saying that protection of transgender rights is there in place and government has done its job, or the 377 has gone down. Right? So we need to think about not just make us so spectacular and rethink about our necropolitical allyship. Yes, your solidarity should not be dependent on our death. Yes. Don't you want to listen to us? Any more?
I was really interested in what you had to say about surveillance. So I teach as a concept to my students, and I talk about panopticon and the idea of the few watching the many, and what digitalization was supposed to do in terms of body cams and sharing of footage on social media is turn surveillance from a panoptical exercise to a synoptical exercise, which is the many watching the few. And this was meant to be the kind of measure that would balance the scales, that would bring neutrality into the practice of policing, because now you had evidence with which to hold police accountable. So I just wanted to know, it's been used with some effect in racial issues in countries like the United States of America, where you see body cam footage of police officers being disproportionately violent in apprehending suspects, especially black suspects. So I just wanted to know from you, what do you think the scope of this kind of technology is in the context of India? And whether you had perhaps some recommendations to make in terms of using synoptic technology by the common man, considering social media is now within reach of everyone. Just what is the prospect of this actually making a difference in terms of introducing neutrality to policing practice?
Can I?
To what extent is India susceptible to the proliferation of surveillance capitalism akin to China models, particularly considering the caste-based societal issues? Also, she talked about blacks being the minority in the United States, and in China we've seen the minority Uyghur Muslims being targeted.
Hello, it was very insightful session. Thanks, Zorain. Thanks, Nikita. I have a two set of questions, and before I say that, I see a lot of parallel drawn from who get desired and who get incarcerated very well. My question being is that, what would you say, is it incarceration or upper caste, I would say bracket like Brahminical hegemony, or is it policing or objectification that makes our Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi bodies carceral or not to be equal? And this extending beyond this police administration and making to legal aid and what happens in judiciary in the court of laws, you see a lot of DBA people happens to be found guilty, victimized, and happen to put down into jails. What Project 39A has also worked on for so long. Do you think DBA bodies are marked in that sense? And is it I know in our conversation a lot has been answered, but I just want to be more binary reflective in that sense. Yeah.
So I think a lot of what you said about body cams and that those kind of technologies being efficacious in the Indian context, I think so these are negotiations that people are making with structures of power, right? These are these are not meant to be solutions, because I mean, this is not a solution-based problem to begin with, which is why like an app can't fix it. And so, you know, whether some of these technologies are useful or not, whether it's, you know, CCTV, so on and so forth, I think they might have, and of course, you know, I'm also being cautious of the fact that like people that belong to criminalized communities, I mean, it's ultimately on them to figure how, you know, how they're making meaning of these technologies in terms of asserting their agency, because it's theirs too and nobody else's to dictate or determine. But what I can speak to is a sort of very limited understanding of the way that, you know, we have seen policing, is to say that these are negotiations that people are making with the system, right? Which is something that people have been doing traditionally with, say, like systems like the informants, or even joining the police force at various ranks. You know, you're able to exercise some kind of autonomy to resist that system. But negotiations are not meant to, you know, liberate, right? It's meant to allow people to navigate and make things bearable on a day-to-day basis, which is what like having something like body cam evidence can do. Because even if you did have body cam evidence on that white officer who killed a black person, you know he's not going to be prosecuted, right? And you know that the body cam and the evidence of the footage that the body cam is producing is not going to stop the profiling of black people, right? It's because that is existing outside of the body cam. And I mean, that is existing in the whiteness of the white officer, right? And I think that is the system of whiteness and white supremacy, which the body cam or an app or any other platform cannot challenge. It can perhaps find a way to, you know, make it less violent, and that's also, you know, I think optimism. But that's the best that it can do, which is also the project of reform, right? Like reform can only make something violent less violent or oppressive less oppressive. It doesn't cease to be as such through reform of any kind, which is, I think, what technology, even as a tool of negotiation, is a reformist tool. And it's useful. I mean, a lot of people think that people who are invested or, you know, interested in the project of abolition, or, you know, in the case of India, the project of annihilation, are people that are not interested in reform. I mean, they are very much engaging with reformist questions, also because in many cases people don't have the choice, right? Like, for, you know, I mean, utopia is going to emerge, whatever it may be, through these negotiations and these imperfect kind of negotiations in various ways, whether it's as being the informant or a beat guard, or, you know, installing CCTV cameras, or even, like you said, through social media, creating these footages, right? A lot of them that circulated during the pandemic. But these are, you know, these are steps that people are taking. It's a means to an end and not an end in itself. What was the other? Surveillance capital? No, sorry, I've forgotten.
I was asking, to what extent is India going in the way China is? In the capitalism and surveillance.
I think, I mean, the Chinese example is, of course, the history of, you know, the criminalization and the sort of penal colonies of Uyghur Muslims that have been built is one form of surveillance capitalism. I think in India, like, caste has has found its way to construct around, you know, structures of capitalism, right? So which is why when we speak also about class, or we speak about capitalist structures, we're speaking about them as being Brahminical constructs within the Indian context. So now, of course, when you see like big tech coming in, when you see like these companies entering India, they are going to partner with Adani, right? Like Adani then becomes their sort of entry point, because Adani understands the Indian market, and Adani is like the homegrown capital within the Indian context, right? So surveillance, and surveillance capitalism has always, and that, like, it's not to say that the Chinese model is being replicated. Of course, certain ways of kinds of technology, whether it's China or whether it's also Israel, right, through Pegasus, etc. Like, these are technologies that are being bought and borrowed, but these are also acquiring homegrown forms, right? And they're also, which is why a lot of, when the big tech companies also enter here, they tap into the Indian startup scenario, right? These are homegrown companies, like really obscure companies in Hyderabad, in Surat, that are making these technologies. So it's also tapping into what is, the sort of version or the structure of, capitalism as it's operating here. So I wouldn't say that it's the Chinese model that is being implemented, but it's I think the kind of ethos, which is also an ethos that is, I mean, in all of these various surveillance state or police states are learning from each other, right? Like, as much as India is learning from Israel and actively borrowing from Israel, Israel is also learning from India. So a lot of these authoritarian, Zionist, Brahminical playbooks are also in that way modeled off of each other, but still very, very rooted here. And also, which is also policing, is that it's a heterogeneous institution. So surveillance techniques are also not homogeneously applied. It's a very localized force. Like, you will not surveil a Muslim person in the same way as you surveil a Dalit person. Or you will not surveil like an Adivasi person in the same way that you surveil, say, an Adivasi Muslim person. So it's very, very centered on local knowledge, local practices, local understandings, and then moving around that. What's the other question?
I was thinking, of course, the app is not the solution, and we need to think about, is reform the solution? What does reform mean for people who are the receiving end of most of this violence that we are thinking about? And I was just reminded of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, if you've heard of. She's an abolition feminist geographer, and she wrote a beautiful book called Golden Gulag in 2007. And Ruthie talks about, that, you think that because in Western context, US context, is an industrial complex. At least it's not industrial here yet. We do not know the way in which privatization is going forward. It might end up becoming the same story, right? And as race is wedded there, it would be caste that would be central to the imagination of that industrial complex. Right? But when Ruthie Wilson Gilmore talks about, it's not just not stop producing prisons. More prisons you produce, you will find more people to fill the prisons. So it is that, that's why if you look at the incarceration data, like it's more than the capacity that it can hold. And you'll find people to fill it, because if you want to trade it off as a model that can actually required, like you want more prisons, how do you justify that? You'll find prisoners to fill it, right? It's also the way in which the technology is being sold to us. So carcerality, we need to understand, is both spatial, but it's also emplaced somewhere. It's also embodied, right? And it's also affective, as we were talking about. Right? And that's something that we need to think about when we talk about surveillance, the idea of auto-surveillance that is making such grounds. We're surveilling ourselves. We don't need now the system to surveil us, right? Automatically we enter at metro and an announcement happens, koi bhi lawaris cheez bam ho sakti hai. Right, and imagine if somebody is wearing, as a major politician said, you can recognize people by their clothes, right? If it's somebody enters in a flight who's wearing a Muslim cap, right? You'd immediately think about and look around when the announcement happened, who are you researching for? Or when a person who has the receiving end of that violence enters into these spaces, how do they self-monitor and survey their own conduct and movements? How should I behave that it doesn't trigger your anxieties? It doesn't trigger the sanctity of the space that you want to maintain. Right? And probably what we are trying to think about is how to challenge that sanctity itself. Right? Because if our bodies desanctify that space, then probably that space itself needs to be recodified and remade into something else. And that's what anti-caste politics is. That's why in United States they're talking about abolition and we are talking about annihilation, as Nikita just spoke about. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation that we had and for this exciting engagement. And thank you, Nikita, for doing this wonderful work that she has been doing.
Suffice to say, that has been an incredibly engaging session covering themes such as the synonymous nature of caste and carcerality, the historical and continued nature of datafication used to exclude certain bodies and communities, among a plethora of other themes. Thank you so much, Nikita and Professor Dhiren, for sharing your thoughts with us today. Can I please request two of our students, Surbhi and Sumedha, to help facilitate Nikita and Professor Dhiren? I'd now like to request Muskan Tibriwala, Assistant Director for the Law and Marginalization Clinic, CJLS, and Anmol Diwan, Assistant Professor and Senior Research Associate at CJLS, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your time and engagement with the annual Law and Justice Scholar Lecture 2024. On behalf of the Center for Justice, Law and Society, we would like to extend a formal thank you to the 2023-24 CJLS Law and Justice Scholar Nikita Sanavne and Professor Dhiren Borisa for a wonderful and provocative conversation and for being longtime supporters of our work at the center. We also had a great turnout today, and therefore I want to thank all of our audience for taking time out of their busy schedules. Your participation has been a great motivation for us, and we have had a wonderful time hosting these discussions and conversations and hope to continue to do so in the future. Before we conclude, we would also like to thank the team at JGLS, particularly Vikas Chandok, Shala, Rohit, Rahul, Ajay, Ravindra, Vishnu, and Gaurav, and all the members of the AV and IT team who have helped us organize this event and ensure its success.
We also want to thank and acknowledge the tremendous effort of the team at Taj, including Sonakshi, AV team, events team, who have been instrumental in providing us with this space to have this conversation and for the food that you're about to get downstairs. To the audience and students from JGLS who joined us, especially the wonderful students from the Criminal Justice, Policing, Carcerality in India course, thank you for being here. And to our friends from CPAP, and for contributing your valuable time, experience, thoughts, and care to the space over the last 1 year since Nikita joined us. A warm thank you to CJLS team behind the scenes who have helped us put this event together, including Disha, Firoza, Natasha, Surbhi, Harshit, Anushka, Hari Karthik. My concluding vote of thanks is for Professor C. Rajkumar for his continued support for our work at the center, to Professor Srijit, and of course to Professor Deepika Jain for her excellent guidance and mentorship at the center. On behalf of all of us at CJLS, thank you so much, Nikita and Dhiren. It's been an absolute pleasure. We hope to have, thank you so much for everything, and hope all of you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Fine.